So here we go.
Okay, great.
Martyn Jones, thank you for speaking with me today. I saw that you had a new book out, Laughing at Big Data, and instantly drawn to that. I've known of you for several years, being connected to you on LinkedIn, but this is really other than a short call last week, that we've had a chance to talk. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this podcast with me. We'll see how it goes.
Sure, sounds good. Thanks for the invitation, Jack.
You're welcome. For the benefit of the folks listening, there will be show notes and links and resources on the show page on the website. And but if you could you give us some background on where you came from and what led you to laugh at big data?
Sure. Well, I joined a company called Sperry Corporation back at the beginning of the 80s, and essentially not to be involved in the technical part of the operations, but in the business part. And what happened there was that eventually I ended up also in the technical part of the business, with specific interests in database technologies and mainframe platforms for building basically the precursor of data warehouses, which were called then information centers. So I've been in data for a very long time, and one of the problems that we do get, because in Sperry Corporation we were competing against some very big players like IBM, but other players such as NCR, Honeywell, and Burroughs, and Digital, and so on. So part of my work there was to convince prospects and customers that the best company to go with in terms of that technology, those technologies, was Sperry Unibank. And I spent a lot of time there trying to convince, basically listening to people about their needs, and then coming up with strategies in order for them to be able to get what they needed in sort of the most cost-effective way, the most appropriate way possible. So I was involved in that for a very long time, and I've stayed in that side of the business ever since, in basically listening to customers and prospects, their needs, and in designing means to address the challenges that those people are facing, but through the means of using data and technologies in order to augment what they want to do. So that's basically where I'm coming from. And in terms of why did I write Laughing at Big Data, I guess one of the most difficult aspects of trying to sell well architected and designed solutions is the amount of competition that there is out there vying for that same business, but with tools that are not really appropriate, or with approaches that are not really appropriate, and actually don't deliver any significant value. In fact, a lot of them take away value, or take away resources that would be otherwise used for more constructive and valuable initiatives. That's one of the problems I've had with big data, because it when big data started to lose its shine, the people naturally were looking around for other markets in which to push this technology, because essentially it's just technology. It's no business process, no method to it. They basically were saying that, look, you don't need a data warehouse, just put it all in Hadoop and you can query it any which way, how, which was obviously not true, because also being involved in the sort of the bleeding edge side of technologies for many years with these companies, well aware that what they were offering were old lamps for not so old lamps, as it were. Basically old technology repackaged And
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
sorry, the reason why laughing at big data is the fact that it's all come and done now, and a lot of people actually see it for what it is. So it's the emperor's new clothes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm drawn to that message. You quote a number of people in the book. I don't have the exact quotes right in front of me, unfortunately, but the one gentleman talked about really what they liked about. I guess it was more in terms of cloud computing in general, but they already had the technology. It was essentially relabeling it, remarketing the same equipment, the same software they had, the same set of services, just a relabeling. And
Oh, sure, yes.
in the book, you mention this idea that every generation, I'm going to shift gears here. You don't quite say it this way, but every generation sort of assumes that they've invented sex. And you talk about that in terms of technology and process and how this, if you could talk a little bit about how you talk about it in the book, this, it's really nothing new. It's a repackaging of old technologies as something supposedly brand new, big data.
Sure. Yes, I mean even the need for, in many cases, for big data is questionable. But in the past, you've had organizations that have done things like having data collected in order to do preventive maintenance, and you had it with banking equipment even in the late 80s. So that sort of like IoT type setup isn't actually that new. I mean, it's much more democratic than it used to be, because you had to pay big money to be able to do it, but it was possible to do it. And the same with the aircraft testing, for example. They collected a lot of data, and they've been collecting a lot of data and storing it and analyzing it for a very long time, well before big data came along. And for example, the likes of Boeing have been doing that sort of thing for a very long time. Also, in terms of integrated circuit testing and collecting the results, that generates a lot of data. And the likes of Infineon, I know for a fact, because I did some work with them, they collect massive amounts of data. And they were doing this well before big data came along. And they were able to process it well before big data came along. So they were able to, for example, when they identified design issues in the process, in the manufacturing stage, they could halt the production very quickly in order not to produce at a high cost faulty integrated circuits. So that's also been around for a long time. And I guess one of the biggest examples of data warehousing I have been involved in was the architecting of the enterprise data warehouse for Bank of China. And you're talking about something like 150 million customers accounts. And again, it could be sold as a big data success story, but it wasn't. In fact, it was, again, something that was done well before the emergence of big data.
I think that's, to me, is the main point I'm pulling out of your book, and that it really is simply a marketing of technologies that were already there, and you know, the marketers have to eat too, I suppose. So, and they're not all bad people. It's just they do bad things, frankly. You mentioned that it's really there's nothing new, and so, you know, so what? But I think you started to mention this earlier. Maybe you could expand on it, that it's not so much what this repackaging, although it's a problem, it's what it the implications are that the funds are not that are sucked into these big data projects, and then they're gone, and very often they're wasted because the projects themselves fail. And so what could
Yes.
have been done isn't done. So it really is a loss of wealth, and it's funny in the sense that, well, what are you going to do?
Oh,
But it's not funny because it's a true loss of wealth. Maybe you could talk
yes.
about a few specifics or expand on that.
Well, from a certain perspective, it's like sharing the wealth around, but not necessarily to those who deserve it. But yes, it's, how would I put this? When I first started working for Sperry Corporation, and especially when I was working with the end clients, one of the things that my boss really insisted on, and he was a marketing and salesperson, he insisted that I told the client the truth, no matter what the salesperson said. And he said, you've got to be absolutely sure in your mind that whatever is being sold can be delivered. It doesn't matter if you have to make all the programmers jump through hoops in order to be able to implement it. It has to be doable.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, you don't go there. And I think that's been dropped at some point or another. And now it's like, well, it might do the job. I'm not really sure. Um, it's almost like, look at it from a very trivial perspective. Um, any way of storing data should be sufficient to support any type of processing. But of course, it's not the case. And there are certain things that you can do with relational databases that you can't do with standard file store, and there's things you can do with standard file store that you can't do with relational. But there seems to be a willful ignorance with regards to what you can and can't do efficiently, or even it's the idea that you can buy a lot of this commodity hardware, you can buy a lot of almost like software that's in the public domain. So it's going to be cheaper from that perspective, but the overall implementation is going to be much more costly. And that's even before you start looking at the cost of failure. And of course, what other companies tend to do as well is to try and mitigate the failures by trying to do something else and then compounding their problem rather than just abandoning as early as and as how can I put it? Abandoning these failing projects as early and gracefully as possible.
Right. Well, I think that's a good lead into when you talk about a specific technology. There, use databases as an example. I know a little bit about that. A long time ago, and there's probably in big data centers, there's still something called vSAM. I still, frankly, don't exactly understand what that is, but I kind of got my feet wet into databases when relational databases really came onto the market. I came up with came through the Sybase ranks, if you will, and Microsoft has essentially, took that technology over, and it's Microsoft SQL Server and so forth. There's a difference in kind between what vSAM did and how you interacted with it, and what you could do with a relational database. And now they have these things called NoSQL, and it's more, to me, it's more of a hierarchical kind of approach. They have their advantages, disadvantages. There are different things, and there's specifics, and people can talk about specifics. But I think one of the troubles that I have with big data, and I think it speaks to what you're talking about, is that, well, what is it? It's kind of like socialism in the sense that it's like, if you like it, you're talking about this thing out there on the horizon, and it's beautiful, and we're all going to have peace and glory together. Okay, great. But then you look at the failures, like, well, the USSR. Well, that wasn't really socialism. or whatever. The bad examples, the failures. Oh, that wasn't really socialism, and so that's what I keep coming back to that with, well, what is big data? Maybe that's a good spot. We could stop there and say, I think I know what you think big data is, but to the people who believe, they're part of the faith, what is big data? And then from that we could turn into, well, what should a CEO know about it, or maybe IT in general? But let's define what big data is. You want to have a go at that?
Sure. It's a very murky area because it's been defined in terms of volumes of data, so velocities of data, how quickly data is being generated and moved around, and a variety of data. So it's not just textual data. It can be any digital form. So it can be images, it can be video, it can be sound, it could be signal data. It can be data from machineries, from the environmental data, all sorts of data. So that's how it's been defined, as in terms of what they call the 3 V's of volume, variety, and velocity. But then it falls apart because when you question this definition, people are also already saying that, yes, but it doesn't really mean volume, and it doesn't really mean velocity. It can also mean small amounts of data. And then you go, well, that's just data. I mean, in fact, all of it's just data anyway. So why are you making the distinction between big data and data, all the data that's there? And there's never a satisfactory answer to that question for probably for obvious reasons. But so when CEOs and the C-suite get bamboozled into thinking that they must adopt big data, or they'll, their organizations will die, because that's sort of the message that gets put around sometimes. If you're not in it, you're not going to be around for very long. And a lot of companies adopted it, thinking, well, we're not going to be the odd ones out. We'll do it as well, without even being able to first of all, not asking themselves the question, or even giving reasonable answers to the question of to what ends. What is this going to provide the business, other than this so-called advantage through big data? And they obviously haven't had people going to them and saying, look, a lot of data doesn't necessarily mean good data. And doing a lot of this complex analytics or deep learning or data mining isn't necessarily going to give you good options on which you can make good decisions. Because sometimes it's decisions, you don't need a lot of data to make really good decisions. But so I'm very wary. I look at big data and I think, well, it's a marketing ploy, but I was never really particularly bothered about it until it started to encroach on the areas that I'm particularly interested in. It's like well-engineered, architected ways of delivering data to where it's needed. So that's one of the reasons I actually reacted to this world of big data marketing.
In the book, there's a lot in there, and I had hoped to read through it, frankly, before we talked, and I kept getting slowed down because it's funny, and it's interesting. You ask a lot of questions that aren't answered, that the big data folks don't answer, or they answer in ways that are disingenuous, and I think it's well worth the read. And again, for the benefit of the listener, links to the book and to Martyn's website and contact information and all that will be in the show notes and so forth. I highly recommend the book itself. There's the chapters that I've gone through here. I really like that. There's one in particular, Agile at Scale, and I think it's kind of an offshoot of this big data approach. It's little different in the sense that they are not the same thing. Agile at scale is something else, but they fit hand in glove in the sense, to me, in the sense that uh, they don't really solve a problem other than perhaps the marketer's ability to bamboozle the buyer into buying something that they may or may not actually need. Whereas big data, I think is as you pointed out, is there are the underlying technologies predated big data, and of course there's always something new. There's faster hardware. There's different software, but the essential technologies and methods were predated the concept of big data, and I think that's true about agile at scale too. And I wonder if you could let's start with that in your mind, or perhaps in the minds of the proponents. What is agile at scale?
Right. Well, initially I assumed that agile at scale was somehow related to the agile approach and things like Scrum. It is in a way, but not quite. From my perspective, if you're doing software development and you got really experienced and highly skilled developers, then agile is perfect. If you don't have highly experienced people, even without an understanding of the business, then agile is as bad as any other methodology. Agile at scale builds on the partial success of agile in that it's been sold by IT, thanks to the encouragement from some of the big consulting companies, to use agile for every aspect of the business. So if you want to do something in marketing that involves producing new products, you use agile at scale. If you do that in IT, you use agile at scale, which is basically removing the possibility of using regular agile and regular Scrum, because it imposes quite a complex structure, quite a complex process, that is by its nature is deficient, because it's like working in a sort of a highly centralized state, and with all the sort of the evils and problems that come with that highly organized sort of society, and it's and basically it's not working. And where I've seen it being introduced, I would say I've been in organizations that have used strict methods, but they were nothing like as complex and as restrictive and as and involved with so many different moving parts than agile at scale. It's just and I'm basically lost for words in sometimes when trying to describe what it actually is that the agile at scale people are doing. But for me, it's the closest thing I've come to a cult in IT, and I think it's an word for either business or for IT itself.
Well, I was about to say, you're a good Welshman raised with manners, and you're sensitive to other people's religions. But that's, I think, what it's come to be. Is it has its own liturgy and practices about it that are kind of irrelevant to the business itself. I mean, I don't know. Pick one from a hat, but you have a list of marketing projects. Okay, you can call it a backlog. That's fine. I love that word. It's a backlog. Have you made the financial case that this particular project deserves to be on the perhaps list? Have you gone through a process of ranking what you think your most attractive marketing projects are, or IT projects, or product, your new product designs or ideas? You go through a process of ranking those. You look at your budget and you figure out, well, what can we do, or what should we try and do? And of course, I mean, there's all sorts of practices and methodologies to do that in various disciplines, and what's appropriate is appropriate, and it's going to be different. It's going to be appropriate, for different companies, and but to overlay this additional thing on top of it is, it to me, it speaks of big consulting. Is flamdoodle a real word? Flamdoodle, is that Welsh? I'm not sure.
Oh yes, yes. Up the north, it's the Muse of Wales.
Okay. Well, we didn't touch on this at the beginning of our talk here, but it's April 16th. It's now it's about 9:30 in the morning, Eastern U.S. You're actually in Spain.
Yes.
How are things there? We're in the middle of a pandemic. It looks like we may be on the downside of it. How are you there? How are things there?
Well, I'm stuck in the middle of the countryside. I'm about 7 kilometers from the nearest gas station. There's the social distance in this little, well, I'd probably call it the hamlet. There's so few people here, so few houses. It's about 200 meters. So at other times I would miss the city, because I like things that you can only get in the city. But
Mm-hmm.
the fact that we're all in lockdown, I prefer to be here than in the city itself. So that's
Yeah,
good.
I'm glad you're safe, and just in terms of your work, how has it impacted your work? Are you, as a consultant, do you work primarily on site, or do you work off site, a mix? How does that work, and what's happened here through this pandemic?
What I fortunately, what I did last year at the end of my formal on-site engagement was to move to this part of Spain, the northwest in Galicia, and I've basically taken time off to complete a couple of projects that I've been wanting to do for quite some time, and I've been working with some clients remotely, but I've tended to use the time for other activities. At the moment, I mean, generally, I work on things where it's necessary to work face to face with the client, because that's what the client wants. They like to see the person. So I tend to be on site, and also with other things that involve not only my architectural duties, but management as well. You have to be there in order to present a face and to be able to manage successfully. So that I'm not doing right now. But so things are very quiet, I would say, very quiet, and it's necessary to look at new ways of generating business
Mm-hmm.
using. Fortunately, we have the internet, because if it was back in the early 90s, it would be quite problematic to be facing this pandemic. I mean, the other thing is that Spain has been particularly severely hit by this pandemic, and they say almost as bad as Italy. And we don't know how it's going to affect, for example, the UK yet.
Mm-hmm.
They took a slightly different strategy, and well, hope that it works. But I think nobody can say at this point how it's going to really evolve. I mean, we all hope that it's going to sort of, the cases of contagion are going to flatten and then drop. But at the moment, we're just seeing a deceleration in the number of cases, and it's not actually dropping. So yeah, but out here in the wilds of Galicia, I don't think the COVID-19 has any interest of coming out all the way out here. There's so few people.
Well, I hope so. I hope
I hope.
I hope that's the
Yes.
case. And of course, I mean, there's a lot being written and read and discussed about it, and I don't think we want to get into all of that.
No,
Um,
no.
it's it's interesting you bring up. I mean, now with the internet, we're able to do things, have conferences, have calls like this. People are using various screen sharing technologies to do business and to keep moving forward, to stay in touch with friends and family and things. And all that's great. There is the downside that that half a brick fall you can throw a half a brick farther than a brick, and there's a lot of bad information out there, and it travels faster on the internet than anywhere else.
Oh, yeah.
And so there's a
Yes.
downside to all of that. It's it's I haven't done the thought experiment, but if this were to have happened in 1990, without really an internet that's what it is today, there would be a different set of concerns. People literally in the dark trying to
Yeah.
you know. I think we'd still have misinformation and rumor and so forth. It'd just be traveling, maybe not as fast.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, again, I don't want to go too far down that road. It's very interesting. I think it does have implications for big data sets at least, and well, to bring it back around to that, their health data sets are they're large. There's a lot of data, and but the basic technologies, how you work with data. You talking? Well, let me back up. The data is one thing. Whether the the quality of your data series over time is something it's been an issue from from the first census.
Hmm.
And you talk about that in your book, how long statistics has been a discipline, and it's I guess especially right now, it's no less important in the health industry and in the healthcare, public health, than anywhere else in the world right now. And so the quality of the data and how you approach it, and using sound statistical methods. Um, uh, Maybe you could talk about statistics and how that. Um, Again, people might say, "Well, that's big data." Well, not really, and actually they kind of muddy the waters again. Could you talk about that a little bit in terms of what you say in the book and expand on that?
Well, first of all, I'm not a statistician, and what I do know enough is to if I'm in a situation where it requires a statistician to work on something, I will go to a statistician and not try and find a data scientist, um, because it really needs. In my case, when I have these requirements, it really requires a professional who not only understands the methods well, but the implications of the methods, what methods to apply at certain times, and how to read the findings. So how to provide the narrative to the methods, the outcomes from using the methods.
Well, let me jump in there and ask. Friedrich Hayek invented the concept of scientism, and this
Hmm.
false sense that applying inappropriate scientific methods to the wrong discipline, like the methods of
Yeah,
physics to economics in his
sure.
case. So when people generally hear the word data scientist, they think they're dealing with a scientist,
Yes,
but they're not.
absolutely. No.
So maybe you can differentiate those, at least how you use statistician versus data scientist.
Right. I tend to use the word statistician for somebody who's qualified in statistics and has a certain degree of knowledge and experience that's verifiable. Whereas I think a lot of people are moving into the data science area from basically a script writing background and some database knowledge. which isn't really the same thing. And there's the case made that okay, the advantage of the data scientist knowing about databases gives them an advantage over a statistician. But I counter that by saying, look, if the statistician doesn't know how to get the data out, you can always get somebody to work with them to be able to do that. And then, but you're still having the quality statistical analysis that you're looking for. And then, I mean, there are other things. There are, you know, with a lot of theories coming out of data science on how to analyze data, and there's like very complex models being built, and that are not, from my perspective, are infrequently badly explained. Frequently, I would say frequently badly explained, infrequently explained properly. And there's, you know, extremely sophisticated models to work out everything, and expensive software packages to support them. And there are plenty of management consulting companies and even professors at certain universities who take these approaches to statistical analysis. But there's an anecdote I remember about a professor at the University of Columbia had an offer from a rival university, and he couldn't make up his mind whether to stay or to accept the offer. And so he asked a colleague, and his colleague said to him, "Okay, what is your problem? Just maximize your expected subjective utility." And he wondered why that was the case. And he said, "Because that's what you tell your students to do all the time." And the professor replied, "Look, this is serious." And you have the case of, you remember Harry Markowitz?
Harry, no.
Okay, he won. I think, what was it? The John von Neumann. I should remember this. The John von Neumann Theory Prize in '89. But he won the Nobel Prize for Economic Sciences in 1990. And he developed the theory of portfolio decisions for households and firms under conditions of uncertainty. And he won the Nobel Prize for this. But actually, when it came to splitting up his investments for his retirement, he didn't actually use his own model. He used the very basic 1/n distribution. So a lot of people are talking about these highly sophisticated models, but even the people who sort of win the Nobel Prize for these models prefer the more simple approach to things like distribution.
Well, I'm an 80-20 guy. I think simpler is usually better.
Yes.
As you're talking about a statistician versus data scientist, the analogy popped up into my head, not completely exact, but I think it's a statistician is to a data scientist something like a CPA is to a bookkeeper.
Yes.
The bookkeeper knows the tools and they can make the entries, and they may know more than that, but as a function of bookkeeping, they are not a CPA.
No.
Somebody would know how to write scripts and may know 3 or 4 different programming languages and different data stores and how to do what's the best way to do something with the tools. But if they're not well grounded in statistical methods and know what the limits and requirements are of statistics, then they're just not a statistician. And
Sure.
Neither am I, by the way. I would hire a statistician, not be one.
Yes.
It's hard.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Years of training experience. And it's not something I would claim to know much about. Yes. Sorry.
That's okay. Well, when we talked briefly last week, and you kindly agreed to do this call with me. And again, thank you. You suggested that maybe take a concrete example and use that as a way to say, here's what this organization should do or not do. What should they be avoiding? And so if that's okay, I can outline an example, general example, and you can speak to what you think the data, how somebody should go about solving this type of issue.
Sure.
All right. Okay.
Yes.
Well, let's take a company that's you deal with big companies. I think on the smaller end might be a $50-100 million type company. Let's say this company has multiple cost centers, not a trivial number, 8, maybe 10 different cost centers that are geographically distributed. And let's say that they're they're growing, but they're also acquiring companies that have different data sets, it's the same subject domain, but it's been handled, it's been stored differently. There's stuff that fits and there's stuff that doesn't fit together.
Sure.
And they are looking forward, obviously. They're right now they're in the middle of the same crisis that we all are. But they're trying to run the business, trying to move forward, and they need to be able to bring this data together to have some idea of where the profit is in their business and where it's likely to be, and maybe where they're not making money, where they shouldn't be.
Sure. Yes. Yeah. Right.
So that's kind of complex, but it's a general example. How would you approach that?
I mean, in the past, what I've tended to say is, okay, with mergers and acquisitions, what you should try and do as soon as possible is to consolidate data from the general ledgers. And even before you think of swapping out systems and applications. So in order to have a good idea of the financial health of your subsidiary companies or the companies that you've merged with or acquired, then the starting point is the consolidation of the general ledger data. And then basically take it from there. And you can sort of phase out systems over a couple of years because it's typically, a lengthy process.
Okay. Building a data warehouse of some sort is you have these. So let's say you're past the general ledger aspect of it, and
Sure.
you have an ERP system that's up and running, but you have this historical data that's kind of left behind. So you have a go forward transactional processing system. You've got new new orders and invoices and sales and receivables and on the payable side, everything's rolling forward that way, and there's
Sure.
the kind of the inherent tools in the software that's showing you where you're going, I guess. But you have this old data that's sitting in legacy transactional systems. How would you approach the aggregation of that historical data, or would you even bother?
I would try and work out how important that data is to the business itself, or how important that data would be to the acquiring company, and also what are the legal records for that data? Because there's certain transaction data I'm not sure about in the US. I guess it's similar, that you have to keep that data for at least financial transaction data 7 years, for 7 years, even if you're never going to use it. And it's the same. There are data warehouses around the place that are storing data that basically nobody's going to use, because someone had the bright idea. Okay, on top of everything that the business asks for, we'll just store everything else as well, just in case. Which is fine these days, but it's not a good. The data warehouse is not the best place to archive, or the best way to archive. And I mean, there are technologies now that are really good in terms of price performance, outstandingly good in terms of price performance, and you can store a lot of data on those platforms, and you can use it for archival. So it sort of shares the same platform as a data warehouse and the data marts and so on, and the analytics process. But that's where it sort of coincides. It sits on the same box. And if you actually need it sometime in the future, you can pull bits of it out and put it into the data warehouse, because then it's easily accessible. And the same for the ongoing collection of transactional data. I mean, data from operational systems and the data fed back from analytics systems. That all too can be archived more or less on the same box as the data warehouse and the rest of the data stores.
Okay, well,
But
I guess what I hear you saying, if I was your customer, is simply, don't buy a solution looking for a problem to solve.
yes, absolutely.
What my takeaway from that, from what you just said, is you have historical data in various ledgers, and assuming that you can pull those onto, let's just assume for a second that it's all SQL data in one way or another, or it can be put into SQL fairly just one-to-one, no redesign, no re-architecting of data relationships or data models. Just pick it up, put it into a database, a series of databases, and leave it there and there's your legal requirement.
Sure.
And
yes.
If you have as questions arise, build it. If questions start to arise continually, think about doing something more, building an application, doing some restructuring of the data. But until you have dare I say, use case for it, just park the data and you have it in case.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. I'd support that approach.
All right. Well, we're coming to the end of our time here, but I want to thank you. I guess stepping back a bit from that example and back to the big data aspect itself, and what should just in general, what should organizations be doing now when the big data fairies with the magic wands come promising great things? What should they be doing? What shouldn't they be doing? And what should they actively be avoiding?
Sure. I guess I haven't got to the stage where my first reaction would be to say, go away. But it's pretty close to that. I would say, okay, tell me to what ends. And if you can convince me that I need big data, we're going to take out an agreement and you buy into this solution. So you only get a certain amount of revenue generated from me if it's proven that what you propose can be implemented and is successful. Otherwise, you don't get as much. So it's like, okay, 50% upfront and 50% when you show that it works.
Okay. A pilot
Or
project with
yes, yeah, to show
performance.
that you generates, you can use it to generate some sort of business benefit, whether that's, you know, retaining clients or acquiring new ones or upselling, cross-selling, whatever it is. But that company will buy some skin in the game, as it were, put some skin in the game, and take some of the risk, because at the moment it's just the end, the businesses themselves that are taking all the risk, and they're not getting many benefits, which is problematic. So, but on the other hand, I would, you know, I'm sure a lot of these companies can't get past the to what ends question, especially if it's asked again and again repeatedly. So it's, you know, the what is the term for it? The 5 whys or something like that. So you keep on
Yeah.
asking why to the fifth level, and then, you know, if you get satisfactory answers, then maybe, but if not, just walk away from it.
Well, I think that's good advice. When you have a different environment than there is right now, it's easy to get caught up and pushed into, well, my neighbor's doing it. My neighbor has
Yeah.
a new car. My neighbor has a new big data system. You know, the the company, you know, our competitors just announced their big project, so we better get on board. It's
Oh,
easy to
absolutely.
get caught up in that nonsense,
Yes.
that Me
Yes.
Too kind of mentality. And if there are benefits in with uh, what's going on right now, I think it, it's forced upon us time to reflect upon what's truly important. And
Yes.
I think that's a good point for a CEO or a manager, the managers of any company, just to pause before jumping on board to the next new thing. Is to, you know, as you say, I like what it's simple words, but they're the right words. It's to what end? And
Yes. Yeah. That's
prove it, prove it, and then I'll pay you.
yes. Yeah. And I think being put in that position, as I have been in the past, um, if I'm not asked a question, I will ask it myself and then give the answer, because I
Hmm.
think it's an honest thing to do, and you can demonstrate then how you think a business might get value from what you're proposing, because you have sort of concrete, tangible um, arguments for buying what you're offering.
Well, agreed, and I think that's a good point to end on, and maybe another conversation to pick up on. That to what end question, it does ground it grounds the conversation. In another way, it grinds it to a halt, in the sense that, hold on, why are we doing this?
Yes.
What are we? What's important about this? Why is that important? You know, as you said, the 5 whys. Why are we even doing that? Or we're not in that business, or what business are we in? And so you start
Yes.
to think about the fundamentals, and you know, Stephen Covey talked about, you know, first things first, and it's, you know,
Sure.
why are we here? Why does this business exist? Why are we working in this business? Who are we serving? And those kind of questions, and rather than we need the next big data, you know, shiny thing.
Oh, absolutely. I think it was mentioned also in that old book, Megatrends. You know,
Uh-huh.
it's well, I can't remember the name of the airline company, but he said that actually we're not in the business of flying planes. We're in the business of getting things and people from A to B safely and cost effectively.
And you talk about, or you mentioned that in the book, and that was one of the many things that ground me to a halt and stop. Well, let me write this down. It's a good book. I've enjoyed it so far. I'm looking forward to finishing it. And again, I really appreciate you spending the time with me today. And I hope to talk to you soon.
Yeah, you're welcome, Jack. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise. Take care.
Cheers. Thanks a lot. You too. Bye.